In today's episode, we're heading deep into the heart of the African wilderness, where 3 tourists made one fatal mistake, underestimating the wild. From a forbidden swim in the Okavango Delta to a honeymoon safari cut short by a collapsing trail, these are the stories that remind us nature doesn't negotiate. But first, we begin in Tanzania, where a walking tour through lion country ended in seconds, and only one person made it out alive. On July 17, 2022, the Serengeti National Park in Tanzania was experiencing perfect safari weather. Clear skies, moderate temperatures, and wildlife activity at its peak. For 54-year-old Klaus Bergman, a retired engineering professor from Munich, this trip represented the culmination of a lifelong dream. His partner Elise Weber, 51, had surprised him with the safari for his birthday after years of watching wildlife documentaries together in their modest apartment overlooking the Isar River. Klaus had always been methodical and deeply curious, the kind of man who filled shelves with neatly labeled binders of technical journals long after retirement. Reserved but quietly passionate, he developed a love for African wildlife during his university years when he attended a guest lecture on predatory ecology. Ever since, lions and elephants had fascinated him, not just for their strength, but for the precision and intelligence behind their behavior. Elise, on the other hand, was the more intuitive and emotionally attuned of the two. She had worked as a school librarian for nearly 2 decades and had a quiet charm that made children instinctively trust her. While Klaus absorbed technical manuals, Elise favored poetry and memoirs. She was content to let Klaus lead when it came to planning trips or researching camera gear, preferring instead to savor the moment and document their journeys in handwritten travel diaries. They lived in Heidhausen, a historic neighborhood in Munich, in a 3rd-floor flat filled with houseplants, old travel books, and framed photographs from previous adventures across Europe and Asia. The Serengeti trip was meant to be their first and perhaps only adventure into the wild heart of Africa. It wasn't just a vacation, it was a shared milestone, a tribute to everything they had built together over 19 years. What they didn't realize, what no one ever does, is that this would be the last trip they ever take together. Just one more walk, one more morning without knowing it was the end. Klaus had meticulously prepared for this journey, purchasing a Canon EOS R5 specifically for wildlife photography, attending 3 photography workshops, and reading every Serengeti guidebook available. His backpack contained extra memory cards, lens filters, and a notebook where he'd been documenting every species they encountered. The couple had saved for 3 years to afford this premium walking safari experience, choosing Authentic Africa Expeditions for their stellar safety record and small group sizes. Their guide, Joseph Makundi, had led walking safaris for 15 years without incident. That morning, he had conducted the standard safety briefing at the luxury tented camp where the group of 6 tourists had spent the night. He emphasized the importance of staying together, warned against wandering off, and made it clear that in the event of predator encounters, guests were to remain still and follow his instructions without hesitation. He looked each person in the eye as he spoke, silently confirming their understanding. The walking safari had begun at 6:30 a.m., with Joseph leading the way through golden grasslands dotted with acacia trees. By mid-morning, the group had already spotted zebras, giraffes, and a distant herd of elephants. Klaus was ecstatic, his excitement barely containable as he whispered his amazement to Elise. This moment was surpassing everything he had ever imagined. Around 11:15 a.m., the group paused near a small watering hole where a family of warthogs was drinking cautiously. While Joseph was explaining the ecosystem to the other tourists, Klaus noticed a beautiful yellow-billed hornbill perched on a branch about 164 feet away, and in a hushed tone, drew Elise's attention to it. He was eager to capture it, the kind of shot he had envisioned for years. Without alerting Joseph, Klaus and Elise quietly stepped away from the group, moving toward the hornbill with careful, measured steps. Klaus was so focused on framing the perfect photograph that he failed to notice how far they had strayed from the main group. After capturing several shots of the bird, Klaus suggested they return to the group by following what looked like a game trail curving around a cluster of bushes. He was confident that they could rejoin from the other side and reassured Elise, who was beginning to show signs of worry. What Klaus couldn't know was that they had wandered into one of the most dangerous situations possible on an African safari. Hidden in the tall grass beyond the bushes, a lioness was watching her 3 cubs play. The path Klaus and Elise had chosen would place them directly between the mother and her young, a position that would trigger the most primal protective instincts in any predator. At 11:27 a.m., as they rounded the bushes, Elise was the first to notice movement in the grass. 3 lion cubs playing near the bushes. Alarm crept into her voice as she urgently warned Klaus, clutching his arm. She wanted to turn back immediately. Klaus instinctively raised his camera, his photographer's instinct briefly overriding the sense of danger. He muttered something about taking one last shot, already adjusting his lens. The attack came without warning. The lioness, having spotted the humans approaching her vulnerable cubs, launched herself from the hidden position in the grass. She covered the 98 feet between them in mere seconds, a blur of muscle and deadly intent. Klaus barely had time to lower his camera before 180 kilograms of apex predator slammed into him with devastating force. The impact knocked Klaus backwards, his camera flying from his hands as he crashed to the ground. The lioness's powerful jaws clamped down on his neck, a killing technique perfected over millions of years of evolution. Her canines, designed to sever the spinal cords of zebras and wildebeests, easily penetrated Klaus's flesh. Elise's screams echoed across the savannah as she watched in horror. The lioness shook Klaus violently, the way these predators typically kill their prey. His body went limp almost immediately as the bite crushed his trachea and severed his carotid artery. Blood soaked into the parched earth beneath him. The lioness released Klaus momentarily, her instincts telling her to check on her cubs. In that brief pause, she noticed Elise, who had fallen to her knees in shock. Then the predator turned toward the second potential threat. Her blood-stained muzzle low to the ground, muscles tensed for another attack. Elise, paralyzed with fear, could only watch as the lioness approached her with deliberate steps. The predator was just 9 feet away when a sharp crack split the air, a warning shot from Joseph's rifle. The lioness hesitated, torn between protecting her cubs and facing this new threat. Joseph had heard the growl in the distance and sprinted toward the scene, rifle in hand. As he closed the distance, he fired again, louder and closer this time. The lioness, caught between maternal instinct and the advancing danger, snarled but began to back away. Muscles still coiled, she lingered for a tense pause, then turned toward her cubs and slipped into the tall grass, disappearing almost as quickly as she had appeared. The aftermath unfolded with grim efficiency. Joseph radioed for emergency assistance while attempting to comfort a hysterical Elise, who had sustained deep lacerations to her legs from falling onto thorny brush during the attack. Klaus lay motionless on the blood-soaked ground, his eyes open but unseeing. The medical team that arrived 30 minutes later could only confirm what Joseph already knew. Klaus Bergman had died almost immediately from catastrophic trauma to his neck and spine. The incident sent shockwaves through Tanzania's tourism industry. An official investigation was launched by the Tanzanian Wildlife Authority, focusing on whether safety protocols had been followed. While the guide was found to have delivered the standard briefing, the decision to allow the group to split, however briefly, was flagged as a critical failure. Authentic Africa Expeditions responded by overhauling its procedures. Guests were now required to wear GPS trackers during all walking safaris, and an additional ranger was assigned to shadow every group from a distance. The tragedy also prompted new national guidelines discouraging off-path detours, even for photography. Elise survived, but survival came with clarity. How fast the wild turns, how little room there is for error. One lapse was all it took, and it wouldn't be the last. In another part of Africa, under a cloudless sky and beside water that looked harmless, a different kind of silence was waiting. This time it wasn't a lion, it was something older, and it was already beneath the surface. On August 23, 2018, the Okavango Delta in Botswana shimmered under the relentless African sun, temperatures soaring to 104 degrees Fahrenheit by midday. For 38-year-old Luc Moreau, a marketing executive from Lyon, France, this luxury safari represented not just a vacation, but an escape, a hard-earned pause from a relentless, fast-paced life. For nearly 2 decades, Luc had thrived in a high-pressure corporate environment known for his quick thinking, sharp instincts, and tireless work ethic. Colleagues admired him, clients trusted him, and his firm saw him as indispensable. But behind his clean-cut appearance and confident presentations was a man running dangerously low on fuel. He lived alone in a modest, minimalist apartment in Lyon's Confluence district, where floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the Sion River. Every morning he followed the same routine: 5:30 a.m. gym sessions, black coffee, tailored suit, and a barrage of emails before the office even opened. He rarely took vacations, preferring to rack up unused leave while climbing the corporate ladder. Friends had often teased him about his workaholic streak, but Luc had always insisted he was fine, that he'd rest once things settled down. That break never came. After finalizing a major merger that had consumed 18 months of his life, Luc finally hit a wall. He began experiencing migraines, minor panic attacks, and long stretches of mental fog. His doctor had urged him to take time off. A colleague recently back from southern Africa had casually mentioned the Okavango Delta as a peaceful paradise. That same night, Luc had gone online and booked a 2-week stay at Mokolodi Delta Camp, a high-end lodge known for privacy, gourmet cuisine, and raw, unfiltered wilderness. He arrived 3 days before the incident, immediately charmed by the camp's elegant thatched roof cabins overlooking a small lake that branched off from the main delta channels. His accommodation featured an outdoor shower, a private deck, and uninterrupted views of wildlife coming to drink at the water's edge. Luc was struck by how quiet it was. No phones ringing, no buzzing notifications, no artificial urgency. He found himself sleeping longer, breathing deeper, and walking slower, finally feeling like a version of himself he hadn't known in years. During check-in, the lodge manager, Precious Ndlovu, had conducted a thorough safety briefing. She had stressed that guests should never walk unescorted after dark and that swimming in the lake was strictly prohibited due to crocodiles and hippos. Luc had nodded along, though his focus had already drifted to the elephants visible just beyond the deck. He didn't mean to be careless, he just desperately wanted to disconnect. That morning, Luc had joined 5 other guests for a 6-hour game drive led by Cabo, an experienced guide with encyclopedic knowledge of the Delta's ecosystem. The Land Cruiser had departed at 5:30 a.m., allowing them to witness a spectacular sunrise over the floodplains. By 10 a.m., they had already spotted lions lounging after a kill, a leopard draped elegantly over an acacia branch, and countless antelope species grazing on the lush vegetation. Cabo had positioned the vehicle perfectly for photographs, explaining the behavior of each animal with passionate detail. As the day heated up, Luc found himself increasingly uncomfortable. Despite the canvas roof of the safari vehicle, the sun beat down mercilessly, and his light linen shirt clung to his back with sweat. He drained his water bottle quickly, accepting a refill from Cabo's cooler. By the time they returned to the lodge at 11:30 a.m., Luc was thoroughly overheated. While the other guest headed to the dining area for lunch, he retreated to his cabin. The shower provided temporary relief, but stepping back into the humid air left him feeling sticky and uncomfortable almost immediately. From his deck, Luc gazed longingly at the lake just 164 feet from his cabin. The water looked cool and inviting, its surface glassy and still in the midday heat. He could see no signs of the dangerous animals mentioned in the safety briefing, no hippo ears protruding from the surface, no crocodiles sunning themselves on the banks. Just clear, tempting water that promised blessed relief from the oppressive heat. Luc checked his watch, 1:15 p.m. The afternoon game drive wouldn't depart until 4 p.m., leaving nearly 3 hours to kill. What he craved was solitude and coolness. He told himself it would just be a quick dip. 5 minutes in and out, no one would even notice. Decision made, Luke changed into swimming trunks and grabbed a towel. He scanned the area around his cabin. No staff members were visible in the midday heat, most likely taking their own breaks between the morning and afternoon activities. As Luke approached the water's edge, he noticed a faded sign partially obscured by vegetation. "Danger! No swimming crocodiles." He hesitated briefly, then rationalized his decision. The water was clear enough that he could see the sandy bottom near the shore. Surely any large predator would be visible. Besides, he would stay inside the shallows just deep enough to submerge his overheated body briefly before returning to his cabin. At 1:22 p.m., Luke stepped into the lake, sighing with pleasure as the cool water enveloped his ankles, then his calves. The bottom was firm sand, sloping gradually deeper. He waded out until the water reached his waist, then bent his knees to submerge his shoulders. The relief was immediate and exquisite. He closed his eyes, savoring the sensation of heat leaving his body, completely unaware that his movements had already been detected. The Nile crocodile that had claimed this section of the lake as its territory was a massive specimen, nearly 16 feet long and weighing approximately 1,100 pounds. It had been resting in a reed-covered inlet about 90 feet from where Luke entered the water. Though nearly invisible with only its nostrils and eyes breaking the surface, the ancient predator had immediately sensed the vibration of Luke's entrance into its domain. Crocodiles are patient hunters, having perfected their ambush technique over 200 million years of evolution. This particular specimen began moving toward Luke with barely a ripple, its powerful tail propelling it silently through the water while its body remained completely submerged. Its cold, prehistoric brain registered only one thing: prey had entered its territory. Luke, feeling wonderfully refreshed, decided to wade a few feet deeper to fully immerse himself. The water now reached his chest as he moved parallel to the shore, unaware that death was approaching from behind at frightening speed. His first indication that something was wrong came when he noticed small fish darting away in all directions, a split-second warning that came far too late. The attack was devastatingly swift and precise. The crocodile surged forward in a final explosive burst, its massive jaws clamping around Luke's right thigh with bone-crushing force. Over 3,700 pounds of pressure per square inch, more than enough to shatter his femur instantly, closed on his flesh. Luke's scream of shock and agony echoed across the water, cut short as the crocodile executed its instinctive death roll. The predator spun violently, twisting Luke underwater in a disorienting spiral designed to tear chunks from its prey and drown it simultaneously. Water filled his lungs as he was dragged beneath the surface, his body contorting unnaturally with the force of the rotation. His fingers clawed desperately at the crocodile's armored snout, finding no purchase on the prehistoric scales. For a brief moment, the crocodile paused its rolling and Luke broke the surface, gasping and choking. He managed to scream for help before being dragged under again. On the shore, a groundskeeper who had been trimming vegetation heard the cry and looked up in horror to see the water churning violently about 200 feet from the bank. The crocodile rolled again, more powerfully this time. Underwater, Luke felt his consciousness fading as oxygen deprivation and shock took their toll. The pain in his shattered leg had become strangely distant, his body shutting down non-essential functions as it entered survival mode. In his final moments of awareness, he registered being dragged deeper into the lake, away from the shore, away from any possibility of rescue. The groundskeeper ran toward the main lodge, shouting for help. Staff quickly responded, launching a small aluminum boat used for emergency purposes. By the time Cabo and two others reached the lake center, there was nothing to see but expanding ripples and floating reeds. Luke Moreau had vanished completely, dragged to the crocodile's underwater cache, a submerged hollow in the riverbank where large prey is stored until it begins to decompose, making it easier for the reptile to tear apart. A search was immediately launched, with staff members scanning the shoreline and security personnel notifying local authorities. Lodge guests were confined to their cabins as the grim reality of what had happened became clear. Precious, the lodge manager, contacted the French embassy in Gaborone to report the incident, her voice shaking as she explained the circumstances. Luke's body was discovered nearly 24 hours later, partially submerged in a reed bed approximately 650 feet from where he had entered the water. In warmer, oxygen-rich shallows like this part of the delta, decomposition can sometimes release gases quickly enough to float a body within a day. The crocodile had consumed significant portions of his torso and right leg, leaving behind a grisly reminder of nature's brutal efficiency. A team from the Botswana Wildlife Authority captured and euthanized the crocodile responsible, a notorious specimen that local fishermen had nicknamed Old Ghost for its ability to appear and disappear without warning. Mokolodi Delta Camp temporarily closed for a comprehensive safety review, installing additional fencing around water access points and implementing hourly security patrols. Warning signs were made larger and more prominent with multilingual instructions about the lethal danger posed by the Delta's predators. Luke's story is a tragic lesson in ignoring the signs: clear water, invisible danger, and one fatal step too far. But just weeks later, another decision would prove just as deadly. No weather delay, no second chance. Just a newlywed couple and a muddy slope waiting to collapse. On November 12, 2021, dark clouds gathered over Tanzania's Ngorongoro Conservation Area as the short rainy season rolled in. For Anatoly and Elena Petrov, newlyweds from St. Petersburg, the growing storm didn't feel like a warning. It added an edge of wilderness to what was meant to be the most unforgettable journey of their lives. Just 10 days earlier, they had stood in a quiet chapel outside the city, exchanging vows after a 5-year relationship that had carried them through school, hardship, and success. Anatoly, 31, had built a modest tech empire in the wake of the 2017 Bitcoin boom. His charm was quick and unfiltered, and his energy often left people in his orbit breathless. Elena, 29, was precise and calm, a pediatric surgeon who had postponed this honeymoon 3 times to honor her surgical roster. The safari was Anatoly's dream, an escape into nature's raw beauty before settling back into careers and the quiet rhythms of married life. They'd chosen the most exclusive experience available, the Diamond Safari package from Tanzanian Luxury Expeditions. Everything had been arranged to perfection: private lodge, private guide, private vehicle, and a custom itinerary far from the usual tourist routes. The night before, they'd spent hours on the lodge veranda, stargazing over glasses of chilled Chardonnay and tracing their next day's path across a printed map. Anatoly had circled a remote valley known for black rhinos and Cape buffalo. Emmanuel Mkapa, their veteran guide of 15 years, had reviewed the route with them the following morning over breakfast. He'd noticed the sky turning gray at dawn and had hesitated when they discussed the western trails: steeper, narrower, and more sensitive to rain. But Anatoly had pressed, eager to photograph animals others rarely saw, and Elena had agreed, moved by his enthusiasm and reassured by Emmanuel's confidence behind the wheel. By mid-morning, they'd driven deep into the reserve. The vehicle, a reinforced Land Rover Defender with custom suspension and all-terrain tires, handled the uneven terrain with ease. The first hours were everything they had hoped for. They saw a serval cat stalking silently through the tall grass and caught a rare glimpse of a pangolin emerging from under a tree trunk. A black rhino stood silhouetted on a ridge as if posing for them. Elena leaned into Anatoly's shoulder, her expression lit with awe. Anatoly's camera clicked furiously as he narrated every moment into his own memory. As the clock neared 11:30 a.m., a shift came suddenly. The clouds thickened into a dark ceiling overhead, the wind picked up. A few heavy drops landed on the Defender's windshield, then turned into sheets of rain as a thunderclap rolled across the crater basin. Emmanuel, watching the change with growing unease, tapped his phone screen repeatedly, scanning radar maps. The storm was moving in faster than forecast had predicted. He advised a return. Routes would soon become unstable. Anatoly had asked if there might be time for one last stop. The Buffalo Valley he had marked on the map was just ahead and technically closer than the drive back. Emmanuel relented but warned that if conditions worsened, they'd have to turn around immediately. 15 minutes later, the road beneath them began to transform. The dusty trail turned slick, a thick sludge of red mud. The defenders' tires lost traction on mild slopes, and visibility shrank beneath the curtain of falling rain. As they crept forward, the path narrowed, flanked on one side by rising terrain and on the other by a steep drop into a ravine choked with scrub and broken rock. Emmanuel scanned for a safe spot to turn back. He found a slight opening in the brush, a tight curve with barely enough room to maneuver the vehicle, and began to guide the defender through a slow pivot. The slope beneath them, softened by rain, had already started to give way. As the front tires began to straighten, the ground under the right side collapsed. The defender tipped suddenly, the world outside tilting with it. Emmanuel fought the steering wheel instinctively, attempting to pull the vehicle back to level ground, but the Land Rover's weight shifted and momentum took hold. With a groan of metal and a hiss of wet mud, the vehicle slid sideways off the trail and began a rapid descent down the slope. Inside the cabin, Elena gripped Anatoly's hand with white-knuckled panic. He reached across her, instinctively bracing her body, but they were already beyond control. The first impact jolted the vehicle sideways into a hidden boulder, launching it into a barrel roll. The roof crumpled as they flipped. Seatbelt strained, shards of glass burst inward. On the second rotation, Anatoly's head struck the doorframe with catastrophic force. The angle of the impact snapped his neck instantly. When the defender finally landed at the bottom of the ravine, it came to rest upside down, partially submerged in the water, rushing through the thickening storm runoff. Rain thudded against the battered undercarriage as steam hissed from the cracked engine. Elena opened her eyes to a distorted world of blood, metal, and rain. Her forehead throbbed, warmth spilling down into her right eye. Her left arm was limp, broken, and pinned under the center console. She turned and found Anatoly slumped to the side, his neck twisted unnaturally, his expression blank. She stared for a moment, disbelieving. Then something deep in her chest fractured as the truth settled in. The rising water began to lap against her waist. She freed herself with her uninjured arm, gasping as each movement sent bolts of pain through her body. With desperate effort, she dragged herself across the inverted cabin, kicking glass away from a shattered window. Her right leg caught the edge of the frame, slicing it open, but she didn't stop. She pulled herself out into the ravine, collapsing beside the wreckage in the mud, sobbing from pain and loss. Minutes passed, maybe more. She finally gathered enough strength to crawl to a fallen tree trunk and leaned against it, shaking uncontrollably. The stream that had been a trickle was now swelling, turning the base of the ravine into a shallow flood. Then she noticed movement across the water. Dark, slow-moving shapes emerged from the mist, at first unrecognizable through the rain and her half-blurred vision. But soon they took form. A herd of Cape buffalo, their shoulders heavy and slick with rain, pushed forward from the bush, moving toward the stream. Elena remained frozen against the tree, remembering Emmanuel's warnings. Buffalo were unpredictable, territorial, and highly reactive to perceived threats. The lead bull, massive and scarred from past battles, stopped at the edge of the water. He sniffed the air, lifting his nose. His gaze swept the ravine, landing directly on her. Elena tried to quiet her breathing, bury the moan rising from her ribs. But her body betrayed her. A gasp of pain escaped, too loud, too human. The bull's head snapped toward her, eyes locking onto the source of the sound. With terrifying precision, he stepped forward, then broke into a charge. The ground shook as he crossed the shallow water. Elena didn't move. She couldn't. The bull struck her midsection with full force, his horns lifting her off the ground and tossing her into the mud. Before she could process what had happened, he was on her again, horns stabbing into her torso, hooves trampling her chest and shoulders, breaking bones with every impact. She faded quickly, her consciousness slipping away as the herd passed over her, indifferent and unrelenting. The search team found the wreckage the following morning. The Land Rover was buried halfway in the mud, its tires jutting skyward. Emmanuel's body remained strapped in the driver's seat, crushed against the steering wheel. Anatoly had been thrown partially through a broken window during the descent. Elena's remains were discovered farther downstream, her body bearing unmistakable trauma from horn strikes and trampling. The incident triggered a formal investigation by the Ngorongoro Conservation Authority. It confirmed what Emmanuel's logs already showed. He had expressed concern about the forecast, but had proceeded with the couple's request to explore deeper trails. While technically within policy at the time, his decision to continue after the rain began was deemed a critical lapse in judgment. The route they took had a known history of slope erosion during wet conditions. Tanzanian luxury expeditions responded by overhauling its weather protocols, banning off-trail excursions during the rainy season, and requiring real-time terrain monitoring for all private safaris. Emergency response standards were tightened, and access to Western Rim trails was partially restricted until further notice. Back in St. Petersburg, the Petrovs' funeral drew hundreds. Photos from the days before the accident of a smiling couple beneath acacia trees, of a camera focused on a black rhino, stood behind two closed caskets. Their story echoed across continents as a reminder that even in paradise, danger can hide in a single decision. One route, one wrong call, and the wild does not give second chances. Thanks for watching. If you found this story wild, you're definitely going to love the video waiting for you on your end screen right now. Don't miss it, and I'll see you there.